Next, we come to our keynote speaker, Gini Lee, who I'm going to introduce, so you can stand there. But we're going to get the technician to do the thing first, aren't we? Yes. And no, our lovely intern, Anna Jug, is going to come and do the thing. While you're doing the thing, I'll get on with this. Dr. Gini Lee is a landscape architect and interior designer and is the Elisabeth Murdoch Chair of Landscape and occupies the Elisabeth Murdoch Chair of Landscape Architecture at the University of Melbourne. From 2008 to 2011, she was Professor of Landscape Architecture at Queensland University of Technology, and prior to that, Head of the School at the University of South Australia, where she was Researcher and Lecturer in Cultural and Critical Landscapes, Landscape Architecture Studies, and Spatial Interior Design. That's quite a mouthful, Ginny.
Academic.
Yes, it's academic. She has focused on designed landscapes and fragile, arid environments in Australia, and has undertaken multidisciplinary research into the water landscapes of remote territories and investigated ways in which designed landscapes can be applied to the scientific, cultural and indigenous understanding of individuals and communities. Her recent curatorial practice is an experiment with deep mapping methods to investigate the landscape of remote and rural Australia. To give us an overview, another way of looking at our houses and their landscape settings, I invite Gini to give an adapted address from that which she gave in London, given that we don't talk about country houses in Australia, or do we? Gini Lee. Lights down?
Yes, lights down.
Should we do lights down?
I think lights down would be great.
Hold on. Lights down.
Okay, is that enough? That's enough. I know. Up a bit, and I now have to be able to read this. Oop, it's gone. Lights are up. I've hit something. Now we have to go back. There it goes. Thank you. Thanks for that. Well, thank you, everybody. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you very much to Richard and the Copland Foundation. And firstly, actually, the Attingham Trust that gave me the opportunity, together with my colleagues, who I do have to acknowledge, Professor Mark Taylor from the University of Newcastle and Dr. Karen Burns from the University of Melbourne. And we're the people who are looking at the country house as, an expanded research project. And I think what's really marvellous is to be able to join together with so many people who know so much more than I do about this area. So I'm really looking forward to having lots of conversations. Yes, I am the Elisabeth Murdoch Chair of Landscape Architecture. Yes, that is Rupert's mum. And I think the thing is that one of the things about being the Elisabeth Murdoch Chair is also the ability to start to see what her legacy has been in the understanding of landscapes and houses and sponsorship for the arts across Australia. And so that's why I think it's very pertinent for us to be talking about the country house. The reason why we are talking about the country house is that was the title of the Attingham program, and it gave us an opportunity to really start to say, well, what do we think that people over there think about what we do here. And one of the things that I saw very much when we were looking at these marvellous houses and marvellous presentations of people looking at the country house in England is how very often you start with, as Annabelle did, this marvellous photograph of the house in front of you with the landscape about it. This image here, which you may have seen before, it's quite a familiar one, is Eugene von Gerard's From the Veranda of Purrumbete, 1858. And the reason to select this is that this talk draws upon the premise that the Australian country house is one shaped by its landscape, by boom and bust of climate and of economies, by the presence and absence of water, and increasingly by the emerging recognition that Australia was not terra nullius when the first explorers and settlers arrived here only just more than 200 years ago. The two concepts of the country I thought that I should also explain, and I will do it here because Georgina was speaking to us before. Country in Australia has a dual idea. The idea of country and to Aboriginal people is that the landscape grows them up. The landscape is of one with them. Our idea of the country is going to the country, is being in the country, it's being not in the city. And I think that what's very interesting in Australia, and I think probably different to being in the UK, is this dual understanding of what we mean by country and being in it. And I really feel that that's beginning to shape the way that we look at our country houses and country places in the future. So I'm just firstly presenting this brief overview of some of the conditions and types of country houses that we find here. It's not exhaustive, and I'm sure that everyone who's here will be able to add to the selection, but for now I bring you some typologies and approaches that enable working through the very diverse and overlooked entity that is the Australian country house and its garden in the context of its formative landscape. And then the second part of the talk covers two case studies. They're not in any way in the mainstream of regularly visited or well-known country houses, although one is slightly. Through these case studies, you will encounter familiar themes, but with different dynamics, and I finish with a contemporary model for the future, which I suggest is something that's actually developing much, much more. So, why have I got Eugene von Gerard here? The citation says, on most of his trips within Victoria, von Gerard combined visits to homesteads with exploration of less settled regions. By so doing, he was able to obtain commissions to paint homestead portraits from the squatters. Von Gerard's earliest homestead pictures are of Purrumbete, a cattle station situated on Lake Purrumbete, 10 kilometres east of Camperdown in the Western District of Victoria. From the veranda of Purrumbete is exceptional for its compositional inventiveness as an alternative to his well-known painting Purrumbete from Across the Lake, which you'll see later on. It's a typical colonial homestead portrait in composition, which is normally looking at the homestead. But this one actually looks out at the landscape from the interior of the house. Just 1 second. This is a more normal and earlier image of how we would normally look at these first of the country houses of the settlers, and then back to the later one from Purrumbete. So this painting I see heralds a transition from hut to shack to four-room house to increasingly larger houses with the event of prosperity. It shows the view over the landscape, looking out rather than looking at. The view is of the Arcadian landscape, but it also sets up an aspect of surveillance, to be able to see who and what is coming from the distance. For settlers, the veranda is a place of mediation between the inner lives and the harsh nature of the climate in the Australian landscape. And it's also the site of domestic life. You can see just, it's slightly dark, but there's the rug hanging over the balustrade infers the collection inside. So I think this sets up the conceptual map for the establishment of the 19th century rural and often remote country house in Australia. I'm just going to, and with apologies to Western Australia, but I don't know anything about the houses in Western Australia. It's something to be done. These are the kind of areas that we're going to head through today. So all of you who know these places can actually start to say, yes, I can add something to this. I'm going to start with what I would suggest is one of the preeminent country houses. This is Yarralumla. From pastoral beginnings to vice-regal pretensions. Yarralumla and surrounds, including government house, gardens and grounds, dates from the 19th century and is historically highly significant. It's associated with the early grazing history of the limestone plains and was worked as an important local pastoral property through until the early years of the 20th century. Acquired by the Commonwealth following the selection of Canberra as the site for the national capital, Yarralumla was chosen as the residence of Australia's Governor-General and has operated in this role since 1927, when Parliament opened in Canberra. Although intended as a temporary vice-regal residence, Yarralumla became the permanent government house due to economic and other reasons. So this overview of a water, lake, the formal structure and the presence of lawn, perspective of pastoral life in the plains in what was to become the viceregal landscape was brought to life by Walter Burley Griffin. And I noted particularly when I was in London to note the lawn, to note this relationship between the landscape of drought, the landscape of Australia and the perspective of lawn. So this is as it was in 1939, in the presence of Canberra, not yet built but selected as a site. And I think this idea, as I was saying, the presence and availability of water, however, between drought and flood and the vagaries of climate and models brought from home, possibly inappropriately, and transitions of ownership from family to commercial and other interests, is the key to sort of the basis of our understanding of the future of the country house building upon its past. And so the house and the encroaching city today, you can see that with the addition of Lake Burley Griffin and that also this location of this house within the Australian landscape, that we're starting to look at, I guess, the quintessential country house made into something else. My next example that I showed is this idea of these two kind of two estates that are kind of established from the very beginnings. Woolmers and Brickenden in central Tasmania are settler and convict beginnings on country. They show aspects of fortification and defence, and they also show an underlying narrative of unhappy coexistence. In July 2010, Brickenden Estate, along with its neighbouring property, Woolmers Estate, were listed jointly as a World Heritage Site, being part of the Australian Convict Sites World Heritage property. The two estates are regarded as the most significant rural estates in Australia, having the second largest number of convict workers and still retaining a living history from early European settlement to the present day. This overview of the house on the plains and on the escarpment starts to show how we make this link between a convict presence and this gradual development of the house over time. You can see from the actual sketch map there that one of the stories of gradual development over time is also something that continues to play out in most of the country house works. So Woolmers today is now a restored and represented historic site on the well-travelled tourist route through central Tasmania. And I quote, "Woolmers Estate is a pre-eminent example of a property established on an 1817 land grant, which exemplifies the use of convict labour in the assignment system to establish a large pastoral estate. The assignment system was set up to provide convict labour to settlers in exchange for food and clothing, and the government saw the employment of convicts as a cost-effective measure to develop colonial infrastructure and assist settlers in establishing rural and commercial enterprises, while at the same time reforming the convict through industry. The large country estate quickly became established as the archetypal symbol of the assignment system. Estate architecture was regarded as vital in achieving the aims of this system. So the development of Woolmers is now seen as nationally significant as the Homestead Group provides important evidence of the use of an assigned convict labour force in the evolution of a pastoral property based on wool production." So these couple of images of the house today, these are photographed just a year ago, so it's in the middle of summer. And I think the key themes are that it's this composition within a pastoral landscape. There's this idea of wall gardens, convict buildings, mixes of farm styles, and the new National Rose Garden, which also adds to this the original garden as well. So these places become sites for new developments, sometimes strangely, sometimes in harmony, but they are actually a collection of parts. One of the things to sort of talk about here is in fact the idea of the wall garden at Woolmers. Walls are markers of possession and they define territory. The durability of masonry makes them statements of permanency. We're determined to stay and keep others out. So this view of the walled garden, this view of the convict and settlers' places where the convicts lived outside the walls. But also this was also a way of actually keeping a range of people out, including Aboriginal people. This particular John Glover painting of Montacute talks about this idea of the fortified estate. And some of the work that particularly Karen Burns is looking at is how these estates were formed, what are the structures of the houses, gardens in their landscapes, and also the fabric of the houses in terms of fortification and in terms of this understanding of being inside and being out. And this interpretation panel at Warmers, complete with bird droppings, I have to say, is actually also showing this understanding of the relationship between the position and the location of the house, Warmers on the right, and Brickenden down on the plains, as a place of where surveillance was easily seen, where people were able to be really organised due to their particular positions in life or activities they were doing. And the woman down on the right is one of the earliest convicts there. So this understanding of Brickenden and Warmers, the connectivity between the landscape, the position of the various houses and settlements on the landscape is something very much that gives us an idea of how the country house establishes some of those relationships with landscapes from early times. And just actually something that came out of Attingham after the talk, this lovely woman came up to me and said, "Oh, I go past Panshanger, Warmers and Brickenden every day." And that's where she lives in England. And so she said to me, "Why don't you come back over and I'll show you my places," because she's got connections with Australia, particularly with MacArthur, I might say. And she became interested in this interconnection, which she'd heard about, but this had come up. So I just thought, leaving those two examples, that I'd also look at this idea of typologies in terms of what the country house might be, and I'm using some examples from Victoria. And this is of Alton, which some of you may know. The first one is this idea of the hill station as a country house type. Alton is one of a number of such places located in the cooling hills surrounding our cities, Mount Macedon and the Dandenongs near Melbourne, the Blue Mountains in Sydney, Toowoomba and Tamborine, Brisbane and the Adelaide Hills, as we know here. So Mount Macedon represents the most coherent collection of hill station properties in Australia, as that's what Mount Macedon thinks, and as such has been ranked as of world significance by a major study undertaken to assess historic gardens in Victoria. Although this assessment was undertaken prior to the devastating 1983 bushfires, the collection of hill station gardens at Mount Macedon is still widely recognised as being of national significance. Alton, shown here, is one of a small number of mountain retreats in Australia that embodied a terraced hill station character. These characteristics are generally steep and elevated terrain with an outlook over the valleys or plains, and the extensive use of terracing to provide access and to facilitate the pursuit of horticulture. And the website entry for Alton shows this kind of shifting perspectives between when it was established and now. They say Alton, created by Sir George Verdon in the 1870s and then rejuvenated by George Nicholas in the 1920s, is one of Australia's most significant hill station gardens. So they're discussing the garden much more than the house at this stage. The large terrace garden is principally noted for its outstanding trees, both as collection and also for many outstanding individual specimens. The current owners of Alton, and it's in private ownership, have an overall aspiration to bring the garden back to a standard of excellence, but to balance this with the historical significance of the garden as it stands. The next one, Victoria, is the idea of the homestead typology, and this and Murrumbong is now under the ownership of the National Trust of Victoria. Murrumbong is part of the 15,000 hectare squatting run originally taken up in 1838 by the Scottish immigrant Alexander Anderson and his two partners. By the 1920s, the property had been bought by the lawyer and racing identity LKS McKinnon for his son DJ, or Scobie McKinnon, as a 21st birthday present. Scobie became a successful sheep farmer and visited England for the coronation in 1937. There he met and married the Canadian-born Claire Adams, who had been a successful Hollywood silent screen actress in the 1920s. The couple returned to Victoria in 1938, and soon after her arrival, Claire commissioned the Melbourne architect Marcus Martin to modernise the old homestead. The alterations did not change the external footprint of the homestead, but the weatherboards were rendered and most of the 19th century details were removed. Martin redecorated the interior of the house in the modern style and designed a new swimming pool and outdoor entertainment area. Scobie died in 1974, Claire in 1978. The house and the bulk of their estate were bequeathed to the National Trust. The Donald and Claire McKinnon Trust was created to ensure the preservation of the house and gardens and to create their nature reserve, with the adjoining farm to provide financial support for the fauna park and to demonstrate good farming and conservation practices. The house now remains largely as its owners left it, with many of the personal effects of the McKinnons. And I remember seeing her, there's nothing like going through a house and seeing somebody's hairbrush replete with hair, and you think, ooh, it's marvellous, but also very much of their presence. In the reserve, a sample of the natural vegetation and habitat of the basalt plains of Western Victoria as it would have existed before white settlement and grazing is gradually being reinstated. Mooramong is unique in Victoria for its combination of historical, aesthetic and architectural and natural values. And this is how the National Trust sees this, as being a place which is both country house and also the kind of place that will work for conservation. And the landscape estate. And who can go past Werribee for this? Werribee Mansion and Zoological Park. The large property Werribee Park was developed by Thomas Chirnside, a pastoralist, until it was purchased by the Catholic Church in 1922. It remained in their ownership for 50 years until it was acquired by the Victorian Government in 1973, under whose ownership it has become a conference centre, resort and location for the Werribee Park Zoo. It's truly Australia's Longleat in that regard. Chirnside developed a complex of outbuildings on the property through the 1850s, 1860s, including a range of bluestone buildings. The first substantial dwelling on the site was a bluestone homestead and associated sunken ha-ha wall built in 1865. From 1877, this grand landscaped estate was the centre of social life for the brothers, and they hosted sporting events, hunts, balls, vice-regal visits and military displays. So it's set in a landscape which Chirnside developed from the 1860s, but begun in 1877, the formal garden was conceived to complement the building. The original inclusion of a lake and grotto, parterre and fountain, meandering paths and trees to frame views showed the influence of 18th century English landscape movement. And over time there's been this kind of relationship between really restoring to as near as possible to the original and to also really restore the gardens and keep the gardens going, including the grotto, and also reenactment of certain aspects of life. And also this sense that from the original grand plan there's the opportunity with this new use to integrate new architectural styles and new buildings and new insertions into this existing landscape, culminating in the zoo, which you actually feel like you're hallucinating when you're driving across there, and all of a sudden there's a giraffe comes into view on the Geelong Road, not very often, but sometimes. The other thing that I wanted to kind of talk about in terms of research is this kind of desire to inventory and what it actually means when you start to look at the Google map and use this kind of sense of locating the diversity and in some senses the density of the country house. We've been looking at New South Wales as a beginning project for this. To look at mapping the scope and extent of the country house, both ones that are very well known, ones that are in public or private ownership, and a range of places. So it actually really becomes quite interesting when you start to see how the relationship of the country house development has happened in relation to landscape, so development along rivers, the presence of blue mountains and the needs of the pastoral industry to the west of the Great Dividing Range. These annotated Google Maps describe these relationships between water and its availability, climate, economic development and recreation, and our tendency to cling to the coasts and mountains. One such place to bring out of this is to look at the very famous bell trees. And you'll see that we were actually showing the aerial views that we would get from Google first to start to see what it actually means in this kind of ensuing working from the house and into the landscape, and what happens with the intermediate ground between the garden, the use or lack of use of water, and differences and different climatic experiences over time. So when you look at bell trees in the original house and landscape, this is only really part of the property. You start to also see the historic Beltrees homestead and what it was doing when it was this very large 240,000 acres and had 64 houses scattered over it, with close to 60 employees living and working with it. The 52-room homestead was built in 1907, this heritage listed homestead, which still is retained today. So what's happening today is that both the house itself is marketed. It's in the images of the Beltrees website, but actually more than that is the suite of buildings associated with Beltrees that become the economy of this particular place. So it's the association with the large pastoral property, with the house, its garden, its landscape, but actually these are the areas that are mostly there as part of the new economy. And in Queensland, similar kinds of things are happening. Jimbour on the Darling Downs, where the Darling Downs was really established, similarly to the way that the Western District was established, and apparently some of the families, having left the Western District, moved up to the Darling Downs to establish new properties. Jimbour, particularly in its historic sense, is now absolutely a place for weddings, parties and anything. But you can actually see that the structure of the house remains, but in its contemporary sense it becomes something quite different with the addition of palm trees and the like. I now just want to talk quickly about a couple of case studies that I looked at. Certainly in this relationship between families and country houses. I think some of the research that I'm seeing, particularly in the outback, is this increasing sense that the families and dynasties, I suppose, who have developed many of these places are moving on or moving around. The next generation of people are coming on. And in many instances, the families are selling out and moving. And so there's this whole shift between the original intent and understanding of the country house and, in fact, where it's going today. So I keep returning to Von Gerard because I'm wanting to introduce this perspective of Wirrajul and Purrumbete and the manifolds. I'm passing over the Purrumbete, the Von Gerard of Purrumbete, to introduce to you a contemporary representation of that painting that you've been seeing. Marion Manifold is the wife of Ed, and her sense of these days is to start to look at the other stories, the contemporary stories that have come from the families who have developed these two places. And her series of lino cuts start to show, and I think a lot of the sense that we get a lot of our information about country houses or from the representations of these houses starts to happen between the contemporary and the earlier ones. So I'm wanting to talk to you a little bit more about, and I'm actually steaming through this, so have I got 5 minutes? So there's a much larger description about Marion Manifold's project there, at which you can find on her website if you're interested. The Wirrajul landscape is where Marion and Ed currently live, and this returns to our themes of water, climate and rural life. I first visited Wirrajul after they had suffered 10 years of drought and the surrounding landscape was suffering. And just in front, that the lake garden landscape, which was normally full of water, had been dry for 10 years. 18 months later, the drought had broken and the house and garden had returned to its 19th century imagined verdancy. In her genealogical history of homestead building in the Western District, Harriet Edquist charted early primitive origins to more sophisticated architecture of 20th century imagination. She noted that by the 1880s, a regional type had emerged consisting of a low-hipped roof Italianate villa surrounded by a wide veranda, and this type was generally adopted for many properties in the Western District. So without romanticising the lived-in and picturesque qualities of the home, nor engaging in a discussion of economic viability, this homestead is the family home, and visitors are offered guided tours from time to time. Inside the large living hall are arranged various sized Persian pattern rugs and that muffle footsteps and quieten the space. To one side is an area for sitting near a large open fire, and to the other a pair of double doors that lead into a family living room. And this house starts to open up, and within the house there are numerous artefacts, paintings, photographs that record several generations of family history. As a visitor, engagement with these household articles is through both personal interpretation and relayed information. The tour conducted by the Manifolds points out not only what the objects are, but how or why they came into the family. And there's a sequence of images out into the garden, and the marvellous, this is actually a stable building, so the farmhouse buildings, and, things about where family pets are lovingly remembered. And the garden beyond, it's said to have been designed by William Guilfoyle, the master gardener of Melbourne Botanic Gardens. He visited a lot of gardens, and there are many gardens that are said to be in the Guilfoyle manner. And this becomes something of an interest for garden lovers to find out exactly how that's working. And this is post the drought. You can see that the lake is filling up. Okay. Is that finished? 5 minutes? Okay. So Eugene von Gerard, Parambeat from across the lake. It's a very culturally significant property. This is the other view from the other side. And what I'm really wanting to talk about is the contrast between houses. Parambeat, also a manifold property, has now, and these are the two historic photographs pre the Guillaume Purchase renovation, and how it looks today, is now a contemporary conference centre, and it's been on the market for some time, I might say. And this is its entry hall. I think the key contrast between these two places, both coming out of family, is that relationship between the place still lived in and the place that now becomes something other than that. And you might see up in this interior the Walter Withers paintings, which are a very famous account of the development and settlement of the manifold home, of the manifold country. But Marion Manifold as well has made her own lino cuts following from Withers. She writes, "The fragmented women and iconography constructed from old photos, wills and letters, and the decorative idioms that followed, patterns from blinds, porcelain and china in my home, show the losses and little luxuries that were part of the early women settlers here. Her recent works are prompts into methods for reading and participating in extant exteriors and gardens from contemporary perspectives, and they provoke a couple of themes that might be useful. So that the broader landscape is a palimpsest of physical features mapped and marked, and it's also the grounding wallpaper upon which domestic occupation plays out. And secondly, objects and elements drawn from landscape and interior frame occupiable space and enable everyday lives to be carried out in the middle ground of house and work." Now very quickly, because I knew I was going to be out of time, I just thought I'd talk to you about South Australia. And this is another aspect of the family country house. Some of you might know the Hans Huyssen painting, The Land of the Oratunga. That is that's Padawerta, and that is Farga country, up in the Flinders Ranges north of Wilpena Pound. These are the three Farga properties, Nilpena, Angarichna, Oratunga, and that is just a cloud over there. That's not snow in the outback. I think it's important for us to also understand this idea of the outback family houses and pastoral leases of remote South Australia, because they're also part of the country house story, although they're possibly not recognised in the same way as those of the East. Out here, there, pastoral histories, changing rural economies, climate-based tourism and new relationships with contemporary Aboriginal relationships to land through native title agreements are causing a shift in country house occupation. The country was known as the hideous blank by the early explorers, is now a highly desirable destination for national and international travellers. So the Farga family properties have transformed over the past 15 or so years to become layered places where coexistence of pastoral, tourism, art and Aboriginal presence is transforming the culture of the outback. And the first one, and so there's the Hans Heist in the land of the Orotunga and Orotunga country. And the shift and change, it doesn't look so much different, but there are more trees there, is the first one about Nilpena. Nilpena is a property, a cattle station that runs between the Flinders Ranges and Lake Torrens. Most recently, it's been transformed into rabbit-proof fence country. Nilpena is now the site. There's the shearing shed on the left, and one of the houses on the right has become a rich site for a range of films of the outback, and provides a real new economy for the Fargas out there. They also have a range of events that happen in that beautiful old place. And so here is the rabbit-proof fence, nominally in Western Australia, but actually in South Australia. Angarichna, the second house, now a place for five-star housing, five-star tourism. It's its original, so it's actually building upon the original. And the whole stories of Aboriginal occupation are there on the walls to be seen. And I'll be very quick, but one of the things that kept happening in Attingham is everybody would show their dogs in their country houses. And so there are the dogs for the country houses. And a sequence of how these very humble, really outback houses, buildings, outbuildings, are now the shearers' quarters for tourists, the wool shed for events and a range of things in that way, the interior for guests and the interior for others. And finally, Orotunga, which is a hill station which has actually been sold by the Fargas, which is now becoming the future Flinders studio, connected into the Hyson legacy, I suppose. It's now starting to be developed as a place for artists' residencies and, again, a range of events that happen with and of the landscape, and this is that landscape. So my final two words is the one of the future. It's Tarrawarra in the Yarra Valley, the future country house made present. This house, and I'll just say to the lower part of the image is the private house, and to the top of the image is the vineyard, museum and generally public place. It's the art museum, fine dining and vineyard, the use of the landscape, the borrowed landscape and the new constructed landscapes. And the museum, the new architectural event that's become part of the economy of the Yarra Valley. And again, this view from the inside back into the outside landscape, which I think continues to be my theme, and back to von Gerard. And I just want to say, because he might be in the audience, to some extent, the ownership changes to country houses reflect current political and cultural understandings of culturally and historically significant buildings and the position presented through various Australian institutions. At the National Trust, Jim Gardner's priority is the preservation of the great Australian homestead. I'm quoting this. If the family that built it can look after it, wonderful. But my personal view is it's much better solution for some banker from Melbourne or Sydney to roll up in their Porsche with a bucket load of cash than it is for it to slowly deteriorate in the hands of original owners, Gardner says. If it becomes a weekender for some wealthy businessman, at least it will be conserved. Thank you.
Well done. Bang on time. Perfectly delivered and perfectly on time. And a nice little gauntlet thrown down for the lovely Jim, who's at the back. Yes, thank you, Jim. You'll have your chance later. This brings our opening session to a close, the introductory session, the purpose of which was to welcome you all, get you settled in, give you some broad contextual thoughts about who we are, where we are, what we're looking at. But now we move to session 1. You're not getting tea till 3:45, so there's water at the back if you need to get up, move around, stretch. But in just a moment I'm going to introduce Catherine Kovacic, and Tom Perigo is going to take the stand. Pin your ears back, you're in for a treat. Tom, have you got your slides? The slides are on, sir? Good. Catherine, you're going to come up? Grab some water if you need to. Have a stretch. You've got 1 minute for that. We're running a tight ship here.